He has odious secret police that put people in jail for even saying the word war. He's got everything nicely under control. However, what he doesn't have in control, as you astutely point out, is his ruble's crumbling, his interest rates are going up, people are mumbling, and some of the polls, the reliable ones that I've seen out of Russia, small samplings, say that people want this war over, and they know it. And there's caskets coming home, huge numbers of caskets.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Diane Francis, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. She's editor-at-large with the National Post newspaper and has a best-selling Substack with regular updates on geopolitics, including the war in Ukraine and Putin's Russia. Diane, good to see you again. Welcome back. In your recent article, you described the algorithm for Donald Trump's new world order. What is it exactly?
Well, I think that he's not a diplomat and he's not a military guy. He's a business guy. Some may say a lousy one, but he's done okay. And he's basically going to impose some of the tenets of doing a deal. He wants to do deals. People call it negotiations or diplomacy, but basically he has some rules. The art of the deal was outlined in his first book in '87. And that was, know your customer, think big, let him make the first offer, be tough, and that sort of thing. And that's exactly what I think he's doing. So with the war, which he's promised to end in 24 hours after he takes office on the 20th, he's already imposed a deadline. And he's imposed a deadline on all the players by way of saying this is going to be done by the 20th of January and get to it. And so now people are coming forward. Zelensky has come forward with some compromises. NATO has come forward with more support pledged and advice to arm Ukraine even more. Putin has said nothing.
How well do you think President Zelensky appreciates this and the incentives he's presented to Donald Trump to continue supporting Ukraine?
Well, Zelensky, is described as a comedian, but actually he's a tycoon himself. He made millions of dollars as an entertainment businessman. He was a performer, but he was also the producer and writer of all the content that he made so much money on. He gets business. He knows it. So I think when Trump came in, he offered in his victory plan a big carrot to the United States and Europe indirectly and said basically, we have more natural resources than most countries in the world. And in fact, they have almost as many resources as Australia or Canada, 26 trillion in minerals, metals, fossil fuels, all kinds of things. And he's saying that, you're going to have first dibs on doing business and partnering with us if you help us get rid of these guys. And, that's irrespective of whether they lose the 20% of land that they've stolen, the Russians have stolen or not. He basically was making a business negotiation starting offer. And Trump apparently loved it, particularly the fact that Zelensky says, and we'll keep the Chinese out of this after it because they've helped the Russians. But in return for which, we need NATO or security guards, some kind of guarantees that are solid. It's a business proposition.
It's a smart move, isn't it? Do you think it will persuade Donald Trump as he considers how he will make good on that promise to bring a swift end? Do you think
you're right. It got his attention, and it's actually smart because, nobody wants to hear about, we have a right to exist, sovereignty, integrity, all that stuff. They broke the law. We've heard all that. He's a monster. This is genocide. We know all of that. Now let's talk Turkey. What are you going to do for us? And what can I do for you? And you've got to help me here and it'll help you. So it's a win-win business idea. And, that's not to strip away the fact that, the Ukrainians deserve reparations. Putin should go to jail and all of that. But that's aside. So basically, it does, I think, push and propel the process forward somewhat. In addition to which, Zelensky has come out and said, not exactly, but that they would be willing to cede some territory if they get into NATO or even just get an invitation to NATO. And that's kind of being batted around by various players now. So you see, it's a form of negotiation already.
And that is, you mentioned that President Zelensky, now he's publicly talked for the first time about his idea of a ceasefire, where he ended the phase of the war, where he talks about the conditions under which he'd accept it, saying, invite the whole of Ukraine on the 1991 borders to join NATO. We'll accept on the basis of what we actually occupy right now. The rest of it we can resolve diplomatically later. I mean, this is not going to happen, is it? I mean, but it's at least a starting point for negotiations.
Well, I think it's a starting point. And don't forget, too, there's negotiations going on within the Trump camp. He's got some people saying, give them a bunch of weapons and let's blow them up and scare them and make them realize they can't fool around with us. We'll just flood them with weapons. This is a guy named Gorka, who was just rehired by Trump. Then there's others who, like J.D. Vance or the Tucker Carlson, saying, well, they can't win. Leave it where it is. Forget NATO. We don't like NATO anyway, and let's move on. And so he's got, forces within his organization that are also negotiating and debating what the American final position for sitting down or, imposing a deal will be.
And if there is an agreement to be made, how can you ensure Russia would honor it?
Well, I think NATO is key, or even an invitation to NATO. The other thing that I think is interesting about the business proposition with Zelensky is if you invite Americans and Europeans to come in and help partner and develop that country, it'll become a powerhouse. Everybody will get rich. And their investment in sweat and dollars will actually become more of a guarantee of security than joining NATO's alliance, because there'll be money on the line for Europeans and Americans, much more so than ever. So it's kind of a double whammy solution, I think. And, the other thing, too, is that China's been steadily buying up farmland and mining properties and businesses before the war inside Ukraine and through Ukrainian oligarch proxies. And I think also that they have to be disclosed, the beneficial ownership, the Chinese stuff, because they've been in bed with Russia. They have to be kicked out of Ukraine. That's also very appealing to Trump, as well as to the lobby of businessmen and donors who would like to get rich on Ukraine. And you can get rich on Ukraine. It is an incredibly rich piece of land, and that has been forgotten. In much of this, it's been rhetoric and politics and democracy versus autocracy. One of the reasons, Putin wants it is because he can get all those minerals. And by the way, Crimea in particular, which will be contentious, has enough gas to make Europe completely energy independent.
It's a fascinating fact that I'm sure we're going to return to this again in future conversations. Just to broaden out a little bit, France's government just collapsed. The country's in disarray. Like Germany, it's dealing with domestic and economic political crises. Romania might be about to vote in a far-right NATO skeptic president who is Putin friendly. What is the danger, do you think, posed to Ukraine by European crises and political upheaval at the moment?
Well, it's a very great danger. And remember that what happens to Ukraine will happen to Europe. And I think they do at the end of the day, the Europeans understand that. But, democracy is messy. Autocracy isn't. Putin doesn't have any worries about who he pleases at home or his media. He controls it all. But, Macron was a very strong, powerful voice in favor of uniting Europe into some kind of military presence and diplomatic presence to take a very strong and stronger stance on behalf of NATO and to help Ukraine. I regret that Britain left the European Union, because Britain is also a very important military power and moral voice, and has been consistently on the side of the good guys in this fight. And it's too bad they're not inside the EU tent, because I think they would have been the clear-cut leader along with Poland. Germany is just a mess. It's a mess of people who are still third-generation guilt over what they did in the war. The never again line is just constantly haunting their politics. But, as a friend of mine in Germany pointed out, it is as immoral to not join and militarily defend a good cause as to have had a Hitler. So, you have to get involved, and Germany is still in turmoil. So we'll see what happens there.
Can we just talk about Syria for a moment? What effect do you think that Russia's heightened involvement in the reignited civil war there will have on the war in Ukraine?
Well, Russia has been messing around with Syria for a long time, and so has Iran. And, we've talked before about how the Russian mercenaries trained the Hamas guys in Syria in their bases to attack on October 7th, Putin's birthday, Israel, which started the whole thing. Now Syria is falling apart again. It's divided into a number of occupied areas. The Turks are involved, the Islamists are involved, the Yanks are in there, the Kurds are in there, the Russians and the Iranians, Hamas, Hezbollah. It's just, and Israel, of course, is sitting there watching it all. There is only one good development that's come out of that mess, and I feel so sorry for Syrians, is that Russia and Iran are now having to pull resources, military and other, from their other nonsense and wars to get into Syria to try and keep it in their hands and prop up al-Assad to do so. And so it's distracting them, it's weakening them, and their weakened situation is why the rebel forces, some of them led by Turkey, have gone in there to try and fix this. It's a mess.
And do you think actually it will have a tangible effect on the battlefields of Ukraine?
I think it already has. My understanding is that, the Russians are deploying jets to bomb some of these insurgents. They're very actively involved. And, in my latest Substack, I have a map of all the military installations in that country. I mean, everybody's got a fortress there. It's really a mess, and it's a powder keg. And so, yes, they're distracted, and I think it hurts their influence in the Middle East. And I think that it is sapping some of the military power that they have away from Ukraine. To the extent that it's going to turn the tide in Ukraine, no, but anything helps.
Writing in the Telegraph newspaper today, David Axe says Russia may want to sue for peace in Ukraine, or may just have to consider this if it loses its Tartus naval base in Syria, because it will be the only way to maintain its influence in the Mediterranean because of the war. If the war ends, it can then gain access to it via the Black Sea and the Bosphorus Strait. What do you think of that thought?
Well, I think it's all very important. I think they have a beachhead and have done for a long time that they've been building on in Syria, which is one of the problems. And they are now moving into Libya. And one of the things they want to do is they want to further weaponize migration into Europe and flood Africans into, and the Middle Eastern people into across the Med in boats. Yes, it's a listening post. It's very important for them to have it. But let's not forget that the Ukrainians have completely tied their dominance up in the Black Sea, which was much more important to them. And they've driven their navy into different ports because they cannot function. They cannot control the Black Sea. And also Turkey, which is kind of now opposed to Russia in Syria, controls entry to the Black Sea. So Turkey hasn't let Russian warships and aircraft carriers, or American and British ones for that matter, go into the Black Sea. So, yes, the Navy part of this whole thing is very interesting. And then there's also the developments in the Baltic.
And how do you think that Turkey is going to use its power and influence in this context? I mean, already it's resumed the conflict in the north of Syria against what it sees as its Kurdish enemies.
Well, Turkey wants a strong, stable, decent government in Syria because because it's such a mess, the Kurds have been able to gain footholds and bug and create problems along the Turkish border, security problems. Don't also forget that Turkey now houses, I think, 3 or 4 million Syrian refugees from the last civil war in Syria that are just, it's a drain on their country and their economy. And the last thing they want is for Syria to fall apart even more. And they're going to have another 3 or 4 million Syrian refugees in their camps in their country.
So if Assad does fall, it's likely to have consequences be felt well beyond Syria's borders.
Very well beyond. It's going to be Turkey. It's going to spill over into Iraq, where there's some U.S. forces. And Israel is sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, because one of the things that they're concerned about is also a spillover of troops into Golan Heights and so on, Lebanon. But they are very concerned that Hezbollah gets hold of al-Assad's chemical stockpile. stockpile of chemical weapons. And so, or Hezbollah does, or Iran does. And so they're very concerned about that. And if that happens, then all bets are off. Israel will just have to extend its warfare into Syria.
And this all coming at the moment, just before the inauguration of Donald Trump as US president. So many different crises. The danger is that the focus will go away from Ukraine.
Yes and no. I think the focus is on Mr. Trump, who says he can solve that war in 24 hours. He said that. And let's see what he does. And if he does it badly, it's worse than no deal at all, as the Washington Post editorial recently pointed out, because it will give everybody, every tin pot dictator and despot, the idea that they can just move against anything the United States says they can't, and they'll go ahead and do so. So I think the spotlight really is on Mr. Trump, and I'm not sure he's going to disappoint. He's tough, he's ruthless, and he certainly has a lot of offers on the table now already before he forces Putin to go to the table.
So are you feeling quite optimistic then?
Not quite optimistic, a little more than before. A little
Okay.
more than before.
Well, a little less pessimistic then.
That's probably better put.
And let's talk briefly. You mentioned him before, Tucker Carlson, back in Moscow to interview the foreign minister. Yeah, you're shaking your head. To interview the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, saying things like Joe Biden is driving the US even closer to all-out nuclear war with Russia. Does anyone actually listen to this?
Yes, they do. He's got a huge audience, and he gets headlines even from people that loathe him. When he repeats this, he's repeating, I think it's disinformation. He wants to stoke fear. This is another technique that Putin is using. He's using him as a useful fool. Come on over. You like our grocery stores? We'll, give you whatever you want over here, and we'll give you access to top people. And so he's broadcasting the fact that, nuclear war is close. We better be careful. So that is another part of creating an atmosphere of fear, which would and could and is intended to impede more aggressive moves by the Americans and Europeans to get this over with by getting Putin to the table to talk about a reasonable compromise.
And on the truth versus reality, myth kind of balance here, President Putin's addressed the Russia Calling Investment Forum. He talks of economic stability and growth, but there are high interest rates and inflation. How long can he keep the pretense that the Russian economy is in shape?
Well, he's a dictator. He's a complete, total dictator. And he can pretend whatever he wants and get away with it. And he will do that indefinitely. And unfortunately, he will also rule indefinitely. The problem is, if Putin does not want to make a deal, even what some people would consider a good deal, i.e., he gets to keep the land he's stolen so far, he may say no. His people are, shackled to that system. He has odious secret police that put people in jail for even saying the word war. He's got everything nicely under control. However, what he doesn't have in control, as you astutely point out, is his ruble's crumbling, his interest rates are going up, people are mumbling, and some of the polls, the reliable ones that I've seen out of Russia, small samplings, say that people want this war over, and they know it, and there's caskets coming home, huge numbers of caskets.
Mm-hmm. In Britain, a national crime agency operation has smashed a Russian global multi-billion-dollar money laundering organized operation. It spanned more than 30 countries, with money flowing back to Moscow to fund espionage and move cash for sanctioned members of the elite. 84 people arrested, said to be one of the biggest successes of its kind in decades. How much damage can this do to Russia?
Well, I think disrupting their web of illicit financial flows, which have financed the government, bypassed sanctions, and fueled Putin's empire and army and so on. Anything that can disrupt that is excellent. I think great work was done in Britain, and it's not surprising. And they're using crypto, they're using everything they can. Remember, the oligarchs don't have the power. They're actually just trustees for Putin, who actually owns all the money, I think. And they're not in the war. Their kids are not being drafted. They're living in Cannes and London and New York in fancy houses, and they're not really adversely affected at all by it. And their money through these means, these laundering means, is able to get out and be kept safe from anything that might happen. So the more we can do that, to me, is almost as important as the shooting war. It's the financial war that has to be ongoing, intervening on technology transfers that help the war, intervening on arms supplies, intervening on the money. And the next thing that has to happen is the allies have to stop the ships taking oil to India and China, which go through the Baltic Seas and the Black Sea. They've got to do that.
Do you think that the Western allies have been able to think laterally enough about this so far? When you talk about these measures that could be taken, has enough been done? Is it time for a mindset change and more investment in these areas?
I think that it's unwieldy, isn't it? I mean, it's an alliance. NATO is not unwieldy, but it only does the military piece. It should be all over the Baltic Sea for sure, but it doesn't make the decisions as to allocations and finances. It's a unanimous kind of situation. So very often it's enmeshed in gridlock, and there's not things that can be done. And remember, we have far-flung allies in this war, and so there's a lot of moving parts. And so I think that it should culminate and all come together in NATO, in the G7, and I think in the White House. And those three are going to be the drivers to what happens. It's very complicated.
Yeah, we're fast approaching 3 years of conflict in Ukraine. Well, people will say much more than that. In the new year, there will be a new US president in the White House, and already before the year end, there's several potential flashpoints showing. What kind of signals and developments will you be watching out for to indicate whether we plunge into a more dangerous direction or not?
Well, I think you have to see what Trump decides as far as allocating more weapons to Ukraine. If he allocates more weapons, he's trying to impress Putin to get to the table and or kill more Russians. If he doesn't, then it's capitulation, and it's a matter of time before surrender. And on your point too, this is an 11-year war. The first invasion was 2014. That ended up in the kind of DMZ frozen zone that J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson want. Only now it's going to be bigger. And that didn't stop them from coming back in 2022. And then they signed in 2014 a Budapest memorandum with Britain, the US, and others that guaranteed their security, and they reneged. When 2022 happened, the US and Britain did not come in, did not defend Ukraine immediately as they had signed. And so now we have this situation. And, it's obvious the logical extension of two of these nonsensical, situations is going to extend until Russia that will invade a third time and go to the Baltics and the Polish border.
It's often argued about the Budapest memorandum, though, that actually there were no actual guarantees written into it, that it was actually assurances, and it was that fudging in a way that caused the situation. But it was actually, in the end, it was President Putin who broke it and actually invaded Ukraine.
And it was a security guarantee or assurance in return for what Ukraine did. And it held up its end of the bargain, which was it surrendered all of its nuclear weapons to Russia. So it did what it said it would do. And I'm afraid Britain and the United States and the others did not meet their end of the bargain. And that is unforgivable.
What do you think that when we're in this situation now, and we've just marked the 30th anniversary of that memorandum, and we're in the situation where it looks like there will be talk of some kind of ceasefire and negotiations, what can be learnt for the future from that experience so that whatever is agreed is something that holds and protects Ukraine for the future, for the long term?
Well, I think at the very least, Ukraine deserves an invitation to join in a reasonable timeline to join NATO. I think that immediately there's a ceasefire. I think European boots should be on the ground guarding the frontier. not Ukrainians. Ukraine has also offered to swap some of its soldiers for American soldiers guarding NATO bases to save them money. So, I think that, you have to protect the military industrial complex and the country with actual people on the ground instead of a signature, which is worthless after a couple of elections happen. And so that's what's got to happen. The Euros have to get boots on the ground and guard that place. And then, obviously, the consequences, if Russia does this again, are dire. And I don't think Russia would have the guts to do it. They're taking advantage of our disarray.
Diane Francis, great to speak to you. Let's talk again soon.
Sure. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.